Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show where we talk about the translation of Bloodborne. We're still out in the Forbidden Woods, and this time we're going to start with something of a review. Bloodstone Fragment. A fragment of a solid body that is born in death blood. A certain substance dissolved within blood that coagulates after death and does not crystallize is called a bloodstone. The workshop strengthens weapons by carving these bloodstones into them. So I wanted to go back and look at these for a few different reasons. First of all, since I was talking in the last episode about cases where repeated text can make things tricky, I thought I'd start this time by highlighting a case where it actually makes things easier. I'm not sure if you caught it, but towards the end of that item description reading, I actually started switching back and forth between the bloodstone shard and the twin bloodstone shard. Here the image is different, the title is different, and the function, while similar, is different, but the text of the item description is exactly the same. This is true both of the original Japanese text and the English translation. Sometimes in translation, especially in video game translation, you get cases like this, where it really is as simple as reusing text. That having been said, whenever you're using one set of lines in a number of different places, the translation choices that get made for those lines also come up over and over again, so I think it's worth looking at a few of the choices here that I thought were interesting. First up is the passage where the official translation reads, "A substance in the blood hardens." You may have noticed that my more literal version was, "A certain substance dissolved within the blood coagulates after death." And what interests me about this is the decision to move away from the term coagulate, since that word has a strong association with blood in the English language. It would mirror a similar association in the Japanese as well. The relevant word in the original is gyoko, and the first definition of it in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary uses an example sentence that roughly translates to blood coagulates. So why not translate this as a substance in the blood coagulates? Well, I can only speculate, but my own theory is that it's related to the use of another term later in the same line. Remember, the official text goes on to read, "That which does not crystallize is called a bloodstone." This is a somewhat confusing passage to begin with, because we're talking about two solid substances that form out of the same blood after death. The solids that crystallize become blood gems, while the other solids become bloodstones. So, since we're introducing the concept of crystallization, suddenly I think the term harden makes more sense. Bloodstones harden, while blood gems crystallize. Both could be said to coagulate, since in both cases we're getting a solid from a liquid. Again, this distinction is mere speculation on my part, but I think it's an interesting decision. Emphasize the blood-related nature of these items with the term coagulate, or possibly choose a term that makes more sense in opposition to crystallization. This sort of question comes up all the time in translation. By contrast, the final point I wanted to make is more linguistic. Note that literally, the last line has "the workshop" as the subject of the sentence, while the official version changes this, beginning the line with "at the workshop." Grammatically, I'm not sure it matters, but it does make more semantic sense that the workshop not be used as a subject, which I think is interesting. But on to the next item. Bloodstone lump. A lump of a solid body that is born in death blood. A certain substance dissolved within blood that coagulates after death and does not crystallize is called a bloodstone. Those which produce lumps never have the quantity of blood of a normal human. Hunt dangerous enemies. So this was another reason I wanted to review the text of the smaller bloodstones and talk some more about repeated lines, because this item starts out in similar fashion. Both in the English and in the Japanese, the first line is the same except for the changed item names. Both the bloodstone shard and the twin bloodstone shards were referred to as shards or fragments, while this item is called a chunk or a lump. The next line is also exactly the same as the one used in previous bloodstones and involves that choice about hardening as opposed to coagulation I talked about earlier. But the final pair of sentences is unique, and I think this differentiation helps mark this particular item as special, even before getting to the content of these lines. So, let's turn now to the content of those lines, because I think this is another instance of gameplay-relevant information, arguably being more important than the exact phrasing of the Japanese. We've seen this before in items like the wooden shield or the antidote I just used, where some allowance needs to be made for function. Literally, the Japanese informs us that creatures which produce chunks have quantities of blood impossible for normal humans, and then it exhorts the player to hunt dangerous enemies. So clearly, the most important information here is that if a player wants to get bloodstone chunks, which they'll need to continue to upgrade their weapons, they will need to hunt powerful foes. Accordingly, this message has been brought out and emphasized in the official translation, which is worded to clearly convey ordinary humans will never produce bloodstone chunks, and that deadlier foes are to be sought out if bloodstone chunks are needed. The only bit of information that's lost here is some of the reasoning as to why a typical human will never produce a chunk, which is that they simply don't have enough blood. And while this information is interesting, it doesn't strike me as the most important. I can see why it might end up getting cut if the translators needed to stay within certain character or line limitations. Anyway, the last thing I wanted to talk about here are the terms being used for these three different types of bloodstone, beginning with the term for bloodstone in general, because like Titanite in the Dark Souls series, bloodstones are an actual type of mineral. From what I found on Wikipedia, the mineral aggregate heliotrope, which consists of green jasper with red infusions of hematite, is also known as bloodstone because the hematite resembles spots of blood. This is of course nothing to do with the fictional bloodstones of Bloodborne, which are literal stones that form out of the blood of the deceased, but it's interesting to me that there's actually a mineral called bloodstone out there. Regardless of how cool I think that is though, the game needs to create a reasonable sounding progression of names that would be appropriate terminology to apply to minerals used to strengthen weapons. Now, to some extent, they can rely on an existing solution. The Japanese terms for both the shards and the chunks, kakera and katamari, respectively, come straight from Dark Souls. Many players will already be familiar with Titanite shards and Titanite chunks from those games, so keeping those names the same works just fine. In the end, though, I think I'm most impressed with twin bloodstone shards, because it sounds natural, makes sense in the progression, and it's a term unique to this game. Speaking of which, next item. Ritualist's Bone Knife. Knife slathered in suspect cerebrospinal fluid. Defenders of the Underground Labyrinth, especially ritualists, use it as a ritual item. The green cerebrospinal fluid causes temporary stupefaction of awareness. The target who is slashed will be plunged into obliviousness. Perhaps because it was not intended to be used in combat, the knife's edge is dull. Since there is a need to slice deeply, doing so will destroy the blade. Phew, that's a lot of information to take in over a relatively short space of time. And what do you know, I think that's worth discussing, because I'm interested in how that last set of lines in particular got shortened. It sets up a number of interesting translation choices that seem motivated to fit within character and/or line limitations, although I'm not entirely sure why that is. I've alluded to the fact that I find it difficult to fully grasp the limitations of item names and descriptions before, and I thought this might be a good chance to go over a bit of why I find this so tricky. I think one of the longest item descriptions we've read so far, and probably one of the longest item descriptions in the game as a whole, can be found on the 1/3 of umbilical cord that we picked up in the workshop that was hidden down the shaft we can access by taking the elevator out of Erden Chapel. According to my results in Microsoft Word, and looking at the item in the game, this item description consists of 420 characters over 10 lines. The Shaman Bone Blade consists of 340 characters over 8 lines. Now, I've said before that I think 10 lines is probably the game's upper limit, based off how the 11th line displayed in the item description screen never seems to contain any text. But it does make me wonder why, if the translators were running out of space using 8 lines on the Shaman Bone Blade, they wouldn't just add a couple more lines of text to convey a bit more information. It's not as if the translators can't add in additional lines compared to the Japanese text. Comparing the English description of the pebble to the Japanese description of the pebble, where there's no real danger of going over any line limitations, we can see that the English version stretches over 5 lines, while the Japanese uses only 4. Perhaps the specifications changed at some point during the project, and what had been an 8-line maximum was expanded to 10 after the existing translation for the Shaman Bone Blade was approved. That kind of thing is not unheard of, and really it's just one of many reasons why trying to reverse engineer limitations like this is something of a challenge. But with that having been said, let's take a closer look at how exactly this last section was shortened. First, the Japanese simply contains a bit more information than the official English. You can see in my more literal translation that the Japanese refers to the dull edge of the knife, speculating that this is the result of the blades not being intended for use in combat. In the official English, the fact that the blade was never intended to be used in combat is stated, but there's no mention of the dull edge, and therefore the speculative tone can be dropped as well. Second, the wording of the second line of the Japanese has been impressively condensed. What my more literal translation words as, Doing so will destroy the blade, becomes, and breaks. This twofold solution has the benefit of preserving the most relevant information while stating things quite succinctly. Players need to know that this is a consumable item, that even though they've picked up a knife, it's a one-time use thing. Explaining that the blade was never intended to be used in combat and adding that it must cut deeply and therefore breaks serves this purpose admirably while maintaining the fiction of the game. If they don't learn that the knife's edge is dull, perhaps because of the same fact that it wasn't intended to be used in combat, they miss out on a bit of information, but the most important message has been preserved. It's also a choice that really makes me think character space was limited here, though again, it's hard to say for sure. But I think that's enough on the Shaman Bone Blade for now. Let's turn to another item with its own lengthy description. Holy Sword of Ludwig, a trick weapon used especially by hunters of the Healing Church. Famous for being used by Ludwig, the first hunter of the church. The silver sword can be accompanied by its heavy sheath by means of a device, becoming a large sword. The Healing Church workshop, beginning with Ludwig, gave birth to a different style for hunters than aged Gehrman in order to hunt more frightening beasts, or perhaps strange wonders. So first of all, if anyone's curious, that was 399 characters over 10 lines in the official English translation. That said, I've probably spent too much time already discussing this sort of specification, so I'll just note that and move on. The second point I wanted to bring up is one of pronunciation. You probably noticed that as I was reading out my more literal translation, I was emphasizing the k sound in Ludwig, as opposed to pronouncing the character's name as Ludwig, because it's closer to the Japanese used to display the name. In the original, the pronunciation would be Ludwig, and fitting this to a more standard Western pronunciation would leave us saying Ludwig. This I think is interesting because it sounds like there are a number of different pronunciations at play here. The Japanese seems to be based in part off the German version of this name, and I say that because the final sound in Japanese is rendered with a ku. Technically, this seems to be a sound that's in German but not actually used in English. I've seen it described as like making an S sound except at the back of the mouth instead of the front, almost like a snore. So something like k. I probably said that wrong, but ku is probably the Japanese character that would be used to represent this sound. And yet, while the final sound in the name seems to be based on the German, the indicated W pronunciation doesn't seem to match in this case, and the extended E sound that follows it is also apparently uncharacteristic. I'm basing this off the answer to a question on Quora that I've linked in the description, but apparently the W should be pronounced like a V and the E sound should be short, as in bit or fit. Thus, the German pronunciation would sound something like Ludwig. Again, I don't speak German, but there's a difference between that and Ludwig, and it's one that could theoretically have been indicated in the Japanese. So why have I spent all this time looking into pronunciations I can't even really get right myself? First of all, because I think it's cool that there's no real right answer to this question in terms of a real-world pronunciation. The only answer is what's indicated in the game. Also, I'm interested in how the written form of the Japanese is used to suggest a certain spelling using Roman letters that can then be reinterpreted by different audiences around the world. No matter what the original influence on the Japanese katakana usage were, it seems hard to deny that the proper alphabetical spelling here is Ludwig. That spelling then suggests a different natural pronunciation to different speakers of other languages. English speakers may say Ludwig, German speakers may say Ludwig, while to Japanese players it's Ludwig. Each language, maybe even each dialect, puts its own spin on the pronunciation, including the Japanese. So is there an ideal pronunciation here? And if so, which one and why? This is the type of question I think it's fascinating to think about in the context of a language, where even pronunciations within the same language will change over time. And this isn't the only name in Bloodborne where this is a relevant question either. But to go back to the translation comparison, the last thing I wanted to point out was that I think the official English does a good job of making sense of the Japanese in the final line. In particular, I find the last section about hunting things still worse to be impressive. In the original Japanese, the term being used for things other than beasts that Ludwig is training people to hunt is kai. My Daijisen Japanese dictionary gives me two definitions here, the first being a strange occurrence that seems like it can't be happening in reality. This is why my more literal translation uses the term strange wonders. But then there's the second definition, a beast, shape changer, or yokai. So he's training people to fight things that aren't beasts, but are strange beast-like things. It's a little awkward. Also, keep in mind that this is in part a hint of things yet to come in the game, so it's important to get people thinking about what this could be without giving any answers. Not only does the official version sidestep the potential awkwardness here, it's also great at tantalizing players with thoughts of what's to come. And now I'm going to try and take a page from their book and end the episode. Thanks for watching, everyone.